and faithfully serve in their several offices through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
Minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, 12th November 2025 for deferral. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the 12th of November 2025 are deferred at this time.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, 12th November 2025 be deferred. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. We have a letter from Senator the Honorable Wade Mark, President of the Senate of Trinidad and Tobago, dated November 17, 2025, and it reads as follows. Heading expression of appreciation for the hosting of the 68th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference, October 5th to 12th, 2025, Bridgetown, Barbados. On behalf of the delegation of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, I extend our sincere congratulations to the Parliament of Barbados on the successful hosting of the 68th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference. The execution of the conference was managed with the highest level of professionalism, reflecting the efficiency and commitment of your Parliament's leadership. The seamless facilitation of the sessions and the event's overall structure demonstrated exceptional attention to detail. We also wish to express our deep appreciation for the warmth and hospitality extended to our delegation. The professionalism and attentiveness of the protocol officers, conference coordinators, drivers, and all supporting personnel were commendable. Their efforts were instrumental in ensuring participants felt both comfortable and welcome throughout the event. A special thank you to the Honourable Arthur Holder MP, Speaker of the House of Assembly, and Mr. Pedro Eastman, Clerk of Parliament, for their contributions, along with those of others, in ensuring that the Caribbean, Americas, and Atlantic region of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association felt proud of the outstanding success of CPC 2025. Please convey our heartfelt gratitude and congratulations to all involved in ensuring that the 68th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference was such an impeccably executed and memorable gathering. It was indeed a privilege for our delegation to be part of this distinguished conference. Sincerely, Senator the Honourable Wade Mark, President of the Senate of Trinidad and Tobago. There will be further announcements. I have excuses for absence from Senator Dr. Drakes and Her Honour Senator Thompson. And indications of late arrival from Senator Maynard.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to lay the following documents. The Duties, Taxes, and Other Payments Exemption Sanitation Service Authority Number 2, Order of 2025. The Duties, Taxes, and Other Payments Exemption, Atiba Oluko Order of 2025.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate and adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Beg your pardon. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate are moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Orders 45-2 and 22-1 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those standing orders are accordingly suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following items. I beg to move that they be read a first time, to have the first reading of the Companies Economic Substance Repeal Bill of 2025, to move the first reading of the Income Tax Amendment Bill of 2025, the first reading of the Final Appropriation 2022-2023 Bill 2025, the first reading of the Final Appropriation 2023-2024 Bill 2025, and finally, the first reading of the Final Appropriation Bill 2024-2025.
The question is that those aforementioned bills be read a first time. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those bills are accordingly read a first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 10, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Companies Economic Substance Repeal Bill 2025.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg your permission to treat to orders number 10 and 11 as a cognate debate, given the two are inextricably linked.
Honourable Senators, the proposal is to treat these matters as a cognate debate. This is order number 10, Companies Economic Substance Bill, and number 11, amendments to the Income Tax Bill. As I understand it, to move the matters which are currently in the Companies Economic Substance Act into the Income Tax Act. Therefore, the proposals that we treat them as a cognate debate, of course, they will be voted on individually. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. We will therefore treat these as a cognate debate. Ensure, Senator Cummings, that you speak to both matters in your introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The two bills that are before the Honourable Senate this morning, as I've said in my request to treat to them as a cognate debate, relate to, in the first instance, the Companies Economic Substance Act, which is to be repealed, and the provisions that are being repealed from the 2019 legislation for economic substance will then, where applicable, be incorporated into the Income Tax Act, Cap 73. In the first instance, Mr. President, the Economic Substance Act, the Companies Economic Substance Act, fell under the administration of the International Business Unit, the government's Ministry of Energy and Business Unit, and the Income Tax Act falls under the Barbados Revenue Authority. By repealing the Economic Substance Act specific to companies and placing it under the Income Tax Act, under the purview of the Barbados Revenue Authority, we now create a level of synergy whereby a single regime is being managed by a single agency, rather than having parallel overlapping regimes governed by two separate entities. In the first instance, Mr. President, the Economic Substance Repeal Bill at order number 10, it's a very short bill as it stands now. There are 4 sections that are covered here, and the substantial one that I would want to draw attention to would be section 3, speaking to the transitional arrangements which effectively allow for the retention of the compliance requirements under the existing ministry with responsibility for business. And so the rights, powers, privileges, and functions relating to the administration and enforcement of the former act shall continue to be exercisable, that the obligations in the same way for the former act and subsisting immediately before the commencement of this act shall continue to subsist, and that remedies under the former act shall continue to be available, and that the proceedings that were already commenced under the former act shall be continued. And so it also makes reference to the time period where we speak to the 31st day of December 2024, where the former act is now being repealed, and to provide for the entry into force of the new provisions once this repeal has been completed into the Income Tax Act effective January 1, 2025. And you know if I say 2025. And in the Income Tax Act, you now have, again, a short section, and the insertion of the new division into the cap is covered at sections 52A, 52B, 52.3, 52C, and D, Mr. President, that then allow all the way through to F for the provisions, which I will go through in some detail as I cover what economic substance refers to, why Barbados in 2019 came to this honorable chamber, as we recall, to be able to put an economic substance regime in place, and why we're now repealing it, and what has happened globally, specifically with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, with the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, the FHTP, the AML regime, anti-money laundering regime, and how these things now fall under the remit in different ways of the Barbados Revenue Authority as it relates to the collection of corporation taxes and the relevant submissions by companies under the companies legislation, now under the Income Tax Administration, and where the compliance requirements remain under the government's separate body, under the Ministry with Responsibility for Energy and Business, which I have the privilege of leading. So, Mr. President, for those of us who would recall, in January of 2024, Barbados undertook sweeping changes to our taxation regime. Barbados decided at the time, on advice from our international and local advisory team, that given the emergence of the global regime for the convergence of a minimum tax, that Barbados wanted to make sure that we were in a new space. I think all of us would remember the days when Barbados was being blacklisted, when we were being gray-listed, and when we were having any number of issues with our offshore regime, which then transitioned to our international business regime, which has now transitioned into our business regime. All business is local business because all businesses are now registered under the Companies Act. And so, Mr. President, this legislation originally passed in January of 2019, in December 2019, was really meant to correlate to what existed at the time. Now, what you will have, and I will go through them in some detail, 3 instances where the regime that we are repealing will still exist, and the reasons why: shipping, insurance, intellectual property, specifically the patent box. And when the corporation tax reforms took place last January, these were the areas that were also flagged. And so this now would remain as part of the preferential regimes, and I'll tell you the reasons why in a few moments. This, Mr. President, you remember there was a discussion globally and locally around whether Barbados was a no-tax or a low-tax jurisdiction, whether we were a tax haven or not a tax haven. And I've spent enough time covering this issue, meeting with the OECD, traveling to the OECD, making the case on behalf of Barbados, and every other minister with responsibility for international business before me has had to do the same thing. Every other minister of finance has had to do the same thing. And more recently, the minister with responsibility for judicial affairs, the Attorney General, has had to do the same thing, specifically as it relates to our anti-money laundering regime, specifically Forum on Harmful Taxation. And you, Mr. President, wearing a different hat, have been very critical in that process. So in 2024 January, we know that Barbados took the decision to go into a harmonized global minimum tax regime. We introduced the minimum tax of 9%, and that became the standard for companies that fell within scope. And by within scope, I'm speaking specifically of companies that earned over 750 million, with an M, $750 million euros, not 750 million euros per year. That's what is constituted as in scope. So let it be clear, these measures have not been applicable to small businesses in this country. There is no equivalence between this regime and the small business regime. When we started to make the harmonization arrangements, we were basing it on the OECD global standards, What was found globally was that there were a number of companies that were engaging in profit shifting, and companies that were most likely to engage in profit shifting were shifting them to other jurisdictions where taxation levels were lower, and they were not necessarily paying what was considered to be, by some member states, their fair share of taxes. What they found was that the preferential regime created tax arbitrage opportunities, undermined the fairness and integrity of tax systems, and then raised the concerns of base erosion and profit shifting BEPS, which is what I referred to earlier. So the OECD Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, I do not know what's happening to my throat, my voice today. Thank you. Made the decision to dismantle what we used to call ring-fence businesses. We no longer refer to ring-fencing in the international business space globally. That's no longer something that is done. Barbados does not do that. We ensured instead that we had what we called real substance. And what do I mean by real substance? There are some jurisdictions across the region and beyond that have shell companies. You set up a company, but it doesn't carry on any actual business in the jurisdiction. And so Barbados' economic substance regime was specifically to make sure that there was some element of domestic activity for all companies that set up here. One of the things that we also sought to do, Mr. President, was to eliminate incentives that led to the profit shifting that we were speaking about. And so once the OECD attempted to introduce these measures for a global minimum tax to mitigate against these things, Barbados moved in that direction. And so we moved into the category, into the category of having a 9% tax rate, which we know, and then we were required to implement a formal economic substance regime to avoid being labeled as non-cooperative. Now, Mr. President, as you know, despite the number of laws that we have implemented, despite the number of regimes that we have introduced, we still, by some jurisdictions, are deemed as non-cooperative just by virtue of our tax rate. The fact that the tax rate was varying between a cap 5.5% for small businesses, not in the scope here, and 1%, 2%. In other instances, we were deemed by some jurisdictions as non-cooperative. Barbados has attempted to address many of those things. So where are we now? What are we doing now? The major reforms that were adopted in 2024 effectively transformed the tax landscape. It accomplished a couple of things. One, the tax rate that I just spoke about. It aligned with the OECD thresholds and removed those concerns about Barbados being a no or a nominal tax jurisdiction. It put Barbados squarely into the international domain of having a minimum 15% effective tax rate, limiting profit shifting, which I mentioned earlier, and making Barbados' regime more robust and more internationally credible. Barbados also signed the multilateral agreement with the OECD that has the competent authority as the Barbados Revenue Authority, thereby connecting the Barbados Revenue Authority and this Income Tax Act to the repeal of the regime. And so having signed the multilateral cooperation agreement with the OECD, the BRA is obligated to now submit annual reports on that basis. Once we did that, Mr. President, Barbados' risk profile dropped significantly. We were no longer considered in the range that would then lead to the black listing and the gray listing and all those different colors that we had. Most companies then faced standard non-preferential tax treatment, and economic substance requirements were no longer necessary across the board. This allowed for Barbados to enter into the new space. Only three sectors now will continue to benefit from the preferential rate, thereby triggering the enhanced compliance requirements. It is not that they have lower compliance requirements, they actually have higher compliance requirements. And those three sectors I spoke about earlier: shipping, insurance, and the IP patent box. What that means is that you now have the obligation to submit additional documentation to prove compliance to the Barbados Revenue Authority, well, actually to the Ministry with Responsibility for Business, the IBU, who in turn shares that information with the Barbados Revenue Authority. Effectively, by consolidating all of the obligations on the companies under the Income Tax Act, as we have done, we now do a couple of things. We simplify the filing of annual returns under the corporation tax regime. It reduces the duplication between the Ministry with Responsibility for Business and the Barbados Revenue Authority. You now are interfacing with the government of Barbados as if we are one government. Not one agency you have to submit to plus another one submission to the BRA. Best practices have been found in other jurisdictions like Guernsey and Jersey, and we've used those models to be able to develop this process. The FHTP had to be consulted. We never take any of these actions as a ministry or as a government without engaging with the global partners. And so the ministry took responsibility for engaging with the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices and with the OECD Global Forum, and we shared the legislative reforms and the provisions that currently exist with them and got their feedback before we came to Cabinet and before we came to Parliament. And so what you have before you here has come with the agreement and with the blessing of the international agencies. And so on that basis, they have agreed to a couple of things with Barbados. The repeal is to be effective, which is why I said earlier that I deliberately said 2025 January. The repeal will be effective January 1, 2025. Secondly, for previous periods, up to and ending December 31st, 2024, companies that fall within those time periods would have to be compliant with the rules as they existed before. So you would have the period up to 2024, December. All the companies that fall within the regime would have to meet the requirements. The Director of International Business, therefore, the compliance part of it that I said I made reference to in the economic substance section of the income tax legislation, the Director of International Business would retain the powers for audit and enforce the compliance for those periods up to December 2024. The old guidelines would therefore remain valid for those periods up to December 2024. But for fiscal periods going forward from 2025 onward, substance declarations will be filed along with the corporation tax return. If they have to submit documentation, as I have shared, they will be doing so this time from 2025 onward, not to the IBU, but to the Barbados Revenue Authority. Now, what are the strategic implications for Barbados? There are a few. One, it allows us to ensure alignment with the OECD standards and with the EU. Let me take a moment just to qualify. The OECD does not blacklist. We hear that a lot of times. The OECD, for Barbados's purposes, is not a blacklist. The OECD would review under the Forum for Harmful Tax Practices, under the Global Forum, under the Inclusive Forum, and they will make recommendations. Those recommendations go, in the case of the EU, to the EU Code of Conduct. The EU Code of Conduct Committee will then take a position on the basis of the recommendations from the OECD in its various arms. And then the EU will take a determination to agree with or to send back a different position based on what the OECD submits. In some instances, we have seen that while the OECD has made a recommendation that Barbados is compliant and is not to be classified as a non-cooperative jurisdiction, the EU has taken a similar position on recommendation from the OECD. Individual member states have, however, taken the position that their only consideration is that Barbados has a lower tax rate than they do. And so they have maintained Barbados on a blacklist. That is why the global minimum tax was important for Barbados as well. What it does also, Mr. President, is it enforces Barbados's ability to have greater access to global capital markets. By credibility enhancements, Mr. President, you're able to see investors seeing a level of transparency and visibility to the market. Ordinary companies that fall within scope no longer have to face the backlog of unnecessary filings. It removes that from companies. Administrative efficiency, which I've already spoken about, the BRA then takes responsibility for that. And we expect that there are going to be some issues as we go through the transitional phase. And I want to give the assurance that the International Business Unit, and specifically the Director of International Business Unit and her team, will be there and on hand to work with the CTSBs and corporate trust service providers to make certain that any queries that they may have during the period are being answered. So what would I want to say to Barbadians as I say all of this fancy schmancy stuff, OECD, FHTP, Global Poor, Global Forum, International Business Unit, QMDTT, what are all of these things, Mr. President? Here are the main messages that I want to share with you. Most companies in this country will not be affected by economic substance rules. It does not apply. One of the most important messages is just that. The majority of companies in Barbados are not captured by these rules simply because of the amount of annual turnover or annual revenue. Only 3 specific sectors, shipping, insurance, and intellectual property patent box, remain subject to economic substance requirements. For ordinary businesses, including SMEs, manufacturers, retail companies, professional service firms, and domestic enterprises, there is no longer an economic substance requirement. That has been removed, and this reduces the administrative burden. Message number 2, Mr. President, this has nothing to do with taxes for regular businesses. Nothing at all to do. This is not the introduction of a new tax for any companies. Businesses continue paying the standard 9% corporate tax rate, especially when you fall within scope. The other part of it that I would say, Mr. President, the other key message is that the new rules are really designed to protect Barbados in the international system. What I really want Barbadians to understand is that in order for a bank to lend an individual money, they have to have a credit rating. You may go to CariCris, or you may go to one of the agencies and they're going to do a credit report on you, make sure that you have your finances in order, you have a history of paying back your debts, you're servicing your loans, you're servicing your obligations, you are not facing bankruptcy proceedings if you want to apply for new credit. Those are things that typically in our own lives, we understand are part and parcel of day-to-day life. The same thing applies to a country, Mr. President. Barbados has to have a certain level of credibility in order to attract investment. And credibility has come as a consequence, Mr. President, of us introducing in the first instance predictability in the corporation tax regime, the implementation of a series of business rules that we have seen, particularly under the international business sector, as it was then called, and under the Barbados Revenue Authority, but also making reforms as time evolves to make sure that we are keeping pace with the evolution of what's happening globally. So these reforms that we have come over time to this place, to this chamber, and to the other place to make, are really about making sure that Barbados has that international credibility. If we have the blacklisting, in some instances, as has happened in the very recent past, Mr. President, if Barbados was to go from a gray list to a blacklist, there are some companies that would have to move domicile from the country. There are some companies that would no longer be allowed to function in Barbados, and so we have had to make certain that that did not happen. So we have taken every possible action to ensure that Barbados does not find itself in that space. And the message to the international community has been clear. Barbados remains open for global business, and the country wants to make sure that we are reforming to keep pace with what the global community is saying to us. Now, I want to make one or a few points on the sector more broadly, Mr. President. There are a number of additional reforms that are not captured in the legislation, but speak to the overall international business sector. So while we repeal the economic substance provisions, we have the provisions for the sectors that I have mentioned. We bring the regime under the Income Tax Act. There are also additional things that need to be done, and I want to also thank the Barbados International Business Association and the various sector associations with whom, and I say this every time I come here with a bill that's one of my own, we have taken the time to consult with them as well. Once we were proposing to make the repeal amendments and the changes to the income tax legislation, we met with, shared the drafts of the legislation, engaged with them. I myself also spoke at the launch of Global Business Week to the sector to make sure that everyone knew what was being proposed. Everyone welcomed at the time the changes that were being made because they're in the sector and they understood the sector. And so here we are now, having consulted with globally the OECD, locally with the international business community, the global business community, and now we are here with these changes. But there are some additional changes, Mr. President, that we also have indicated that we will and need to make. In 2022, Mr. President, the Cabinet agreed to the creation and the introduction of a beneficial ownership register. As I speak, the team from the International Business Unit has just returned alongside with the team from Business Barbados, formerly CAIPO, from a site visit to CAIPO, which has one of the best, not CAIPO, best to Cayman Islands, one of the best and well-structured beneficial ownership registers. They have just returned, and we are engaging in an exercise to ensure that Barbados can introduce a beneficial ownership register. So that will be a change that we see coming up the way. We've also been engaging with the OECD, Mr. President. There are a number of instances where over the last several years, before this government came into office and since this government came into office, where through the review mechanism, Barbados has been judged to be largely compliant, partially compliant, or compliant in a number of areas. It has been our ambition to ensure that Barbados is compliant. And so we set out a roadmap a year and a half ago where we looked at all of the areas where Barbados was partially compliant. We then looked at the areas where we were largely compliant, and we set a roadmap in place on 3 parallel tracks, including a legislative track. This is one of the pieces of legislation that we set in motion coming out of that, Mr. President. A technology track, Mr. President, and a human resource and a skills-related track to allow for Barbados to move from being partially compliant in the areas that we were to largely compliant, and in the areas that we were largely compliant to move to compliant, so that Barbados will be fully compliant and remain compliant with the skills, the resources, and the technology in place for every portion of the overall regime, and that where reforms were necessary, that we would pivot and make those reforms in a timely manner. And so we have the economic substance regime being repealed, the income tax provisions being changed. The Barbados Revenue Authority has done a commendable job in expanding its capacity. They now have an international relations unit where they, together with the international business unit, travel to all of the OECD meetings, all the global forum meetings, and make sure that there's that synergy at the government level on all matters relating to global business and the global tax regime and the global tax reform structures that need to evolve. And equally so, Mr. President, we also have been working to ensure that we can create that predictable environment for investors. That, Mr. President, is the summary of what is before us in these 2 pieces of legislation, Mr. President, and I want to take the opportunity also to say that we simultaneously have been negotiating a series of double taxation agreements. We have completed negotiations in the last year with Hong Kong in the first round and with Curacao also in 1 round of negotiations. We have started and we will go into 2nd round negotiations with other jurisdictions. We have reconstituted Barbados's treaty negotiating team, and these things are all part and parcel of what Barbados negotiates when we go onto the international stage. And so the treaty negotiating team, Mr. President, has been expanded. It is still led by my team in the Global Business Unit. but it has been expanded to include the Barbados Growth Council. We, of course, have the representatives of the sector. The Barbados Revenue Authority is on that team. Invest Barbados is on that team. And we have a global strategy for the countries with whom we want to ensure Barbados, one, is engaging to come off a blacklist where they exist in individual states. And I'm pleased to share that for those countries where we have traditionally been blacklisted by having a nominal tax regime, now with us evolving into the global minimum tax regime, those countries have already indicated to us in our engagements that the expectation is that at the next review, we will have an opportunity to address the issues that they previously had, and we look forward to what changes may come down the line, and I don't want to presuppose what those changes will be, but we have begun the process of engagement. And I want to, as I close, Mr. President, because I don't want to make this into a broad speech on things that for many people are so far removed from their day-to-day lives that they don't necessarily feel as though they understand it. When we talk about numbers like $750 million, so 750 million euros to be in scope, that is so far out of the average business in Barbados' wheelhouse that I don't want to create the opportunity for the waters to be muddied at all. These measures do not refer at all to the majority of businesses in this country. But they do allow that when the reporting period rolls around at the end of this year, that those companies to which it does apply, that they will have a change in their reporting requirements effective December 2025, and we are in a position to move forward into 2026 now on a clean slate, with Barbados having met and agreed with the OECD on what the new requirements have been that we have delivered, we have promised, and we have delivered. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, hopefully not. Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to make a few comments on these two pieces of legislation because we recognize that they deal with a sector which was once, and probably still is, a very important sector to Barbados and the international business sector. And over the years, we have faced some challenges, not of our own making, but because of shifts in the financing in the world and more so the need for large world powers to bring back home some of the wealth which they thought had left their shores. Barbados has benefited from an international business sector which, one, employed a number of Barbadians, especially lawyers, accountants, and administrators. And that was just a direct involvement in the sector. But then there's also the secondary involvement in the sector where you have a number of persons owning properties here in Barbados because of their involvement in the international business sector, and their employees who worked with them having benefited. At one point in time, I believe that this sector brought in, and I think I have the figures here, in 2007, it was accounted for roughly $492 million in terms of revenue from the sector. When we look at this small amount, and this was basically coming from roughly 3,334 companies at that time. So it is when you look at the overall revenue of these companies, what we benefited from in Barbados probably in most cases did not even account to 0.1% of their overall revenue, because we're speaking about companies that made in excess of billions of dollars or when you combine the overall total, possibly trillions of dollars. And we were quite happy with our $492 million in 2007 because it did benefit Barbados. It did put revenue in our foreign reserves account. It did produce significant employment for a number of professionals. And it gave opportunities to young Barbadians who wanted to qualify in that area, lawyers and accountants and opportunities to work in Barbados, but work for some of the largest companies in the world and be able to manage accounting portfolios of multi-million dollar accounting portfolios, an opportunity which they will probably never get from working with some of our locally based companies. So that's to show how important the sector has been and will continue to be for Barbados. But then over the years, you had the financial crisis from 2007, 8 and on, and you even had like one of our, countries such as Canada in particular, because a number of our international business companies at one point did come out of Canada, but they recognized the importance of bringing some of those taxes back home, started to put pressure on those companies and have some of them relocate from Barbados back into Canada so that they can benefit directly from the taxes, imposing the taxes. Now, once upon a time in debates such as these, the matter which Senator Cummings ended with, the double taxation agreements, that used to dominate the debates in these parliaments in terms of bringing information about the double taxation agreements which we signed with a number of countries, the role of the foreign minister at that time going to a number of different jurisdictions and starting the process. But that has not been sufficient for us to maintain or grab hold or dominance in the area because the double taxation agreements and the tiers were not sufficient. You needed more in terms of the regulation of the industry here in Barbados and more or less the transparency, because the issue then became, are you a tax haven? Are you involved in money laundering? All of those things, and being able to identify the beneficial owners of businesses, and also now with this particular piece of legislation, look at the amount of business which is actually conducted in the jurisdiction, as opposed to it just being a shell company or a file in a drawer in the office of a lawyer, with nothing more, no more activity happening within the jurisdiction. Mr. President, I say all of this because we really need to ask ourselves some serious questions. Because yes, we want the business, but is it fair the amount of hoops that we had to jump through and bend over backward in order to be able to attract the business in our jurisdictions? We do it because we need the opportunities, we need the revenue, we need the jobs for our people,